Good morning, everyone. Yat a long Oxford Kage. Welcome to each and every one of you for joining us for Indigenous Health Topic for June 19, 2026. And we are pleased to have you join us. And just a brief overview of some of the housekeeping rules is we will have time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, and please add your questions in the Q&A chat box. And with no further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Gonzalez. The title of their presentation is Flourishing Indigenous Communities, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Gonzalez, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Let me load my slides up here and share my screen. Let me know if this works. Do you all see Trudy, can you let me know if you see my
Yes,
slides okay?
yes.
Okay. Bonjour, everybody. Miigwech kagwijimien dabe ayaya noma nungum da gaganuniguk. My name is Miigis Gonzalez. I am from the Lakudere Ojibwe community, which is in Wisconsin. I am an assistant scientist at Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, Center for Indigenous Health, and I myself am located at the Great Lakes Hub in Duluth, Minnesota. Um, and I'm happy to be here today to share with you sort of my view of like an Indigenous perspective on flourishing, and what I mean by that is sort of general well-being and mental health and all that is involved there. So, like I said, I'm assistant scientist at Johns Hopkins. We have our main office is in Baltimore, where Johns Hopkins University is, and then we have several, I believe, 11 satellite locations across the United States. We have several in the Southwest, and that is where our center originated from. Our center was evolved out of a partnership with, Johns Hopkins and I believe the White Mountain Apache community. And they were noticing, right, a lot of infant deaths due to dehydration. And actually, through that partnership, is how Pedialyte was developed. So that was something that was really was developed out of that relationship with Indigenous communities there, and that's where Center of Indigenous Health at the time was American Indian Health, but now is Indigenous Health, given that we have several relationships across the globe, right, with Indigenous communities. The Great Lakes Hub in Duluth, Minnesota was formed in 2019 under the leadership of Dr. Melissa Walls, who is Ojibwe as well. She's from Bois Forte and Couchiching. And when they were, asking her to join the center, she was like, "Well, I'm not leaving my community, right?" And so they developed the Great Lakes Hub so that we could all join. And she really has amazing, long-standing relationships with throughout Ojibwe Country, and I'm really grateful to be under her mentorship as well. And then 2, 3 years ago, they developed um, a satellite location in the Great Plains as well. So today, what I would like to share with you all is how I understand how we as Anishinaabe people conceptualize wellness, right? Well-being and health. This is by no means a model that I intend for you to adopt. It's just like a worldview that I hope to provide a little bit of more understanding of. What I hope to share with you all is, teachings that I've been able to have through, relationships with elders, through learning the language, but also by listening to those that carry our language, teachings that I've received during ceremony and just lived experience, right, as an Anishinaabe woman, as an Anishinaabe parent, who truly, truly cares and truly believes in this way of life that we were given as Anishinaabe people, which is so beautiful and centers love and belonging and all those amazing things. I just want to show, for those who might not be familiar with Ojibwe people, or I'll use Ojibwe and Anishinaabe. I use them both really. We are, if you see the first image where it's a lot of purple, like we span a huge area of the United States and Canada. Even the east of here too, from what you can see in this picture. Anishinaabe people we're from that area, and we still live in that area too. And if you look at the smaller picture, you sort of get more where I'm at, and where I'm located, so like I said, I'm from the Lakota community. So if you see in that second photo with that light green, you see Lakota is kind of smack in the middle of that light green. That's where I'm from. That's where I was born and raised. And I'm currently, if you see where the orange is, near that Fond du Lac community, that's where I'm located today. So really close to my home community. But yeah, we're a large group of Indigenous people here in the United States, and you have really strong language and culture as well. All right, so generally, maybe in longer presentations, I give a pretty solid background of like who I am, and I use these some of these photos because they're really representative of the people that shape who I am and continue to shape who I am, right? Folks that have taught me so much about Anishinaabe way of life and how to live good, Anishinaabe values, people that I've learned from and whose teachings that I process information through, right? Anything new, anything more in knowledge or inspiration I receive, I'm like constantly processing through some of these folks' teachings that they've given me. Um, which includes elders, which includes like really strong matriarch in my mom's side of the family, my brothers and sisters, right? And you see a lot of young people here. I'm a mother of four. I have a 10-year-old, all the way down to a 2-year-old. And then I have a lot of nieces and nephews. I'm the youngest of four, so most of actually have a really big span of nieces and nephews and ages, but a lot of nieces and nephews that then get to help me, raise my kids. But I think about them too because they inspire me to do the work that I do. They are also my teachers, right? That they teach me things all the time, and they're leaders in their own right, in our communities and in our ceremonies that they're leading these things. Um, and the amount of experiences and knowledge that they're carrying as young people just continues to get stronger and stronger. And then they're there to teach my kids, and I'm really appreciative of them. And they're also really something that grounds me in the work. So what is flourishing, right? What does flourishing mean? What does well-being mean? If given Anishinaabe teachings, flourishing is not an outcome in my perspective. It's a way of life, right? And it's a way of life, our way of life is thought to be something that was gifted to us, and everything about it is good. That there's not negative things that come out of living this way of life. These photos right here are just really tiny, tiny representations of some of the things that we do as Anishinaabe people, um, in different seasons, right? That we have access to so much throughout our entire lives and entire year. So you have in that top portion, the spring when our maple sap starts to run, and we create syrup and maple sugar out of that. The next one is the summer when our, wild strawberries start growing, and we do our berry picking. And then in the next one is a picture of folks going out and wild ricing. And then the bottom left-hand picture is actually a picture of my niece, and she's out there snaring rabbits. Like in every single season, this is just one thing that we do as Anishinaabe people. And within within each of these activities, there's so much to learn about relationships, about our spiritual health and our physical health. There's so much that's involved in it that requires community and relationships. So much to be thankful for and grateful for, and yet there's so many more things that we do during these different seasons. These are things that we practice throughout our lifespan, and is an ongoing, right, part of our life. So one of the projects I'm going to talk about today, a couple projects that I was able to um, lead in our communities, and what we got to learn from those things. The first one here is was a qualitative project. I really was interested, or I still am, always am, right? Interested in this relationship between li learning and speaking our language, our Indigenous language, and well-being. And so I wanted to do a project to ask our first language speaking elders, what do they think, right? What do they think the relationship is? I was really grateful because I had a lot of community. I'm really beginner speaker, but I had really strong second language fluent speakers that were stepped up and said that they would help me with this project, because what we decided to do was to actually do all of the interviews in Ojibwe. Because if we're talking about the importance of language, right, why wouldn't we do it in the language? And then the analysis too was completed by folks who could understand that the language. We did do a transcription of it too in English, and those folks worked directly with those elders to get it as close as possible. But of course, as probably many Indigenous people know, there's so much that gets lost in translation that English cannot carry the teachings that Ojibwe language has. So I was really grateful for those folks to step up and help. And as I was working with those transcripts, and I was reading them over and over and over again and listening to those elders speak over and over and over again, I thought, man, they're missing something here. And what I realized um as I'm in the health field here is that before I could even think about the connection between language and well-being, there was something about the way in which they were even describing well-being that was starkly different than what we're being taught in school, what is being expressed in some of these Western institutions, right? So I stopped there and I was just like, what are some of these things, right? Um, so when I think about like how did those elders talk about like the outcome, like what is a good life? I mean, these seem simple, but they are also very complex thoughts. But strong and healthy relationships was a major one. Having good feelings, and then living a long and healthy life, a quality of life, right? So they used to say like we lived really old ages, but in those old ages, we were still physically really active and strong. Um, and so that was part of, living a really good life. So this is so that last slide, everything you see there is kind of in this bottom right little circle here, but that says good results. What I always like to preface when I show models like this is that it's really when you create models, like it's really great for the purpose of expressing and some ideas, right? But it also really it stagnates some of those ideas too, where we are living, evolving communities, right? Our elders, what we teach them, what they teach us, I should say, what they teach us. Like I could listen to one story one day, in a year from now, listen to the same story and get a different teaching. So it's like, it's really difficult to like stick something in a model and expect it to really hold everything that was there. But this is the way in which, we do research, but also a way in which I can sort of keep sharing those thoughts of our elders with others. So if you look at the bottom left, is where I usually start people in. It says our way of life in there. These are some of like the basic like activities or basic teachings that we have as Anishinaabe people, like helping others, right? Engaging in nature, right? With our non-human relatives, our sustenance practices, right? our maple sugar, all our wild rice, our berry picking, all those things, and our spiritual practices, our ceremonies. Right? We don't just have one ceremony. We have so many. We have a multitude of ceremonies, right? What we do throughout life, throughout the year, throughout the season. Listening to our elders. Elders are our main leaders, our main are the where we go for advice and for guidance. And then, of course, speaking our language. So the idea here is that there's an arrow that goes from that to our good results, that we could just do those practices and live a really good life because there's so much goodness that's in that. Um, in our spiritual practices that help us create that life, in our sustenance practice that helps us lead out a good life. Um, Without thinking of some of the steeper stuff. So that pathway that you see the circle above shows what can we actually, this is called sort of like a how can we sort of impact that relationship even further? And our elders talked about having a deeper understanding and a deeper belief in this way of life. Using our sema, and our sema is just a spiritual currency, but using that on a daily basis was so important, right? And it is completely tied to our way of life, but being active users of that asema, creates that stronger relationship, taking care of our own life, right? Because we can't take care of others if we can't take care of ourselves, or if we aren't taking care of ourselves, right? Embracing our identity. Again, being proud Anishinaabe people who stand by this way of life and these values, and pursuing our ways. This idea of pursuance is really important for our elders. I'll probably come up later in my presentation too, that we're always becoming, right? We're always evolving, and we're never going to know everything. Would never, ever will we know everything. Never will we like maybe feel like all have everything together. But if we're actively trying to pursue our way of life, pursue different aspects of it, pursue our language, right? That in and of itself is really, really powerful for living a good life. Now, these outer circles too are by no means, they look small, but they're not small, really. They're even bigger than some of these smaller circles. Um, and so the community connectedness and the environmental connectedness, I'll talk about next. And I'm sure you've all heard this before, but we cannot be well as individuals if our community is not well, right? That we cannot be well as individuals if our environment isn't well. I'm sure I know this is a cancer specific, group that comes together. Like that's huge in cancer, right? Is that we need to have clean water, we need to have clean air, and we need to have clean food. And then the spiritual connectedness is the dotted line touches literally everything in this model because that's the way our elders talked about it. Everything was spiritually imbued, everything was like gifted to us spiritually. So that piece is so huge. All right, so what is centered here? Flourishing emerges from ways of knowing, ways of being, and not from symptom reduction. That everything that we do is deeply relational. It's relational to each other, to our families, to our community members, to our non-human relatives, to the land, to our spiritual helpers, right? And that sickness and illness isn't growing from that. It's growing when these relationships and our connection to that traditional knowledge of ours gets buried. And it's been getting buried, right? Under centuries of colonization, oppression, and cultural erasure that still threatens our way of life today. Why representation matters. When others define our well-being, the story changes. So one thing in my field of health research is really difficult. It's not one thing, it's huge. It's so overarching all the time, is that Western health systems, Western research, it measures harm, right? It measures deficit. And then what is measured becomes real to folks. And that it really breeds like a misinterpretation of what's actually happening. and really keeps us from having this like really powerful strength-based perspective on Indigenous health and Indigenous well-being. So what's the problem with deficit narratives, right? So I always think, so I'm a researcher, so I come back to research a lot. And for this, I just want you to like when research is in the hands of Indigenous people, like that research really evolves and really captures like who we can be and who we are as Indigenous people. It's um if you are a reader of research, especially when it comes to Indigenous communities, what you might see in the research, what you might know, quote unquote, know, given the research, is that Native folks have report high rates of anxiety and depression, right? But what you might not know, given the research, because it's not covered as much, is that we actually have really high rates of positive mental health as well. So given the research, you may quote unquote know that we have high rates of adverse childhood experiences, what they call ACEs. But what you might not be aware of is that we have really high rates of benevolent childhood experiences as well. So happy childhood experiences, we have both, right? What you might know from the research is that we have high substance related mortality. But what you might not know is that we have really high rates of abstinence in our communities too. So both of these things can be true, but one is usually the thing that's centered, right? It's usually the thing that's negative that's centered. And so understanding the context of Indigenous communities, Indigenous health is really, really important. So I show these two little snippets of papers that were written. The first one, the cautionary tale, was led by Dr. Melissa Walls, my mentor, and what they were finding in the data was that Indigenous spirituality was connected to lower rates, or I should say higher rates of like negative mental health symptoms, right? Had a non-native person led that research, that would have been the story that was told there. But being that it was led by an Indigenous person, she knew there was a bigger story there. So adding in things like discrimination into the model, adding things like perceiving historical losses, historical cultural losses, that changes the model, that decrease that relationship between spirituality and mental health. What we know from our communities is the more we're connected and engaged and culturally, the more we experience as those losses, right? The more we notice the microaggressions and the discrimination that exists in these systems that we operate within. The other one, the next paper, I had led with my team, and again, if a non-native person had led this, it could have stopped at being enculturated, or in what that means is like engaging culturally is um, is related to an increase in anxiety. And it wasn't at all related into the significantly related to flourishing at all, which was a positive mental health measure. But again, what we know from our communities is that our communities are really coming into this reclamation. And when we do that, that there's a level of what we termed cultural efficacy. So you probably have heard self-efficacy, right? Self-efficacy to do physical activity, right? To run a marathon, like that, you requires a certain set of um, attributes. And so cultural efficacy is kind of the same. So what is someone's level of confidence in engaging culturally, right? That we see a variety of that in our community, given that we had such a loss. And so when we put cultural efficacy, like if someone has higher efficacy, then the model changes, right? That there's actually a decrease. We see a decrease in anxiety, and we now see a positive, significant relationship in flourishing and being enculturated, being engaging in culture. What I wanted to share here, this is another project that we did. And again, we went to our elders, as we often do, to ask ask them what they think and what their perspective is. For this one, what came out of this project was many things. However, what I wanted to share here is just like this flourishing across the lifespan, right? So we were kind of asking about this adolescent development and what that looks like for Anishinaabe people. And so some of the key pieces of this is that if you start in the markers of readiness, like that's our young kids, our children, and they're ready to sort of transition into adulthood um, because they grow up in having some of these teachings, right? They have experiences in some of our Anishinaabe way of life. They have this strong identity as an Anishinaabe person. They've been exposed to the language, they've been exposed to our ceremonies. In that foundation um, creates these markers of readiness that they're ready to transition into adulthood. And then for the markers of adulthood or markers of growth, there was two main ideas there that our elders shared with us. One being that each of us as Anishinaabe people, but I assume each of us in the world, right, have a purpose here in life. That we're here on earth for a reason, right? We have unique gifts that we can share with our communities, we can share with our families. And those gifts are different from one person to the next. And no gift is better than the other, right? Like no purpose is every purpose is is important to the well-being of our communities and our way of life. And that we should, again, that pursuance, right? That we pursue that purpose. And just that pursuance of that purpose is that marker of we're being adults. We're pursuing that purpose. The other piece of this is that every one of our purpose is contributes to community, that those two things go hand in hand. So now we have, um, this idea of that we each have a purpose, and each of those purposes is a good thing. It's a good purpose, right? And no one has anything negative that they're here meant to do. In that, the last circle that says markers of a functioning community, is that makes sense that if each of us, as our adults, are all living our purpose, are all like activating our unique gifts, that we're going to have a really functioning community. That's also shown to when we think about ceremony or community events, right? That we need so many types of people doing so many types of activities or so many types of responsibilities, and that's what makes our ceremonies, or that's what makes the event work really well, is that everyone's working together and nobody's like, that's the important person and that's the person who's going to make this, event successful, right? It's everybody working together. And then the other piece of that final circle is that they expressed, every single one of them expressed that a functioning community, Anishinaabe community, it goes hand in hand with preserving that Anishinaabe way of life, with preserving our activity, the cultural activity that we have, our ceremonies, our language. Um, and then what I think I kind of skipped over here is that bigger circle, which is that spiritual foundation. This specific project, which I really won't go into, but we were talking specifically about ceremony, and um, the beautiful thing that came out of it is that it's not just our one ceremony. It's all of our ceremonies, and they're all interconnected, and all of those ceremonies then provide that foundation for our kiddos, right? To have that strong identity in order to live, good lives. This model is not my model, but I wanted to share it as like another example of all the things I'm kind of talking about. So Dr. Tara Marjorie is Sault Ste. Marie, Ojibwe as well. She developed this model in her dissertation. So she has her MPH in human nutrition at JHU. She has a PhD in social behavioral interventions at JHU. And so she was really interested in the idea of nutrition and how do um, how does sort of like the Western systems understand nutrition? And what she felt really strongly was about was like our Ojibwe indigenous ways, like we didn't think about nutrition, that we thought about nourishment. And that each of our, like, let's say she's a deeply ingrained community member in her tribe, and she's also a really avid hunter. Um, she hunting since a young age, and so she always uses the example of hunting when she presents this model. And I'm not going to use that because I think she's such a solid presenter, and I hope that you all get to hear from her at some point. I'll just use a different example, but let's take wild rice for an example. So how we would kind of think about this model in that example is that wild rice, right, is so much more than good nutrients. Wild rice, by actually engaging in the process of collecting that rice, of harvesting that rice, that requires physical, a little bit of physical endurance, right? It requires, so we have that relationship and that physical activity. It requires that we're not doing it alone. Like you can't even go into a canoe by yourself. Like you have to have somebody, pulling, somebody knocking. That the process of harvesting that wild rice requires a lot of helpers. So we have that relationship of our community that's involved. We also have that relationship with that wild rice, like that's our relative and we treat it as such. And in addition to all of that, right, wild rice, and go back to like the nutrition piece, is super nutrient dense. It has high protein, fiber, good minerals, antioxidants. It could help lower cholesterol, reduce diabetes. Like it's such a valuable grain. So it's really about all of these things that something like wild ricing can provide to an individual or a community. So bringing it back together, Anishinaabe flourishing, in my perspective, it's spiritual. It's very spiritually grounded. It's relationally lived. It's ceremonially cultivated. It's often misread by dominant systems, right? That you could like context matters, right? That representation matters. That when we have these conversations about mental health, even physical, right, emotional health, that we have this broader perspective to lean on. I also know this is, I'm not a cancer researcher, right? I don't, do cancer research, but I really do think it's relevant. And I would love to hear from you all too and the relevancy of it all. But we have a lot of opportunity and support for folks that are um, that carry cancer with them, and have that spiritual support, right? That ceremonial support, but also that emotional and social support as well. And then also when I think about like cancer prevention, cancer treatment, I think about nurturing that whole person, right? And nurturing their environment. And like I said before, our Indigenous way of life also comprises of nurturing someone's whole system, their nutritional health, right? Their physical health, their mental health, in addition to nurturing their environment. Indigenous people all across the globe put above all else these healthy reciprocal relationships with our food, with our medicines, with the water, right? With the land. That our spiritual and cultural practices prioritizes this relationship and are dependent on those healthy relationships. And this is important given the impact that lack of clean water and air and food has on someone's physical health and their susceptibility to chronic illnesses like cancer and other things. So this is where I'll leave it open for conversation, but um, I would love to hear from anyone to better understand or see if this is helpful in understanding Indigenous well-beings and how does that sort of challenge the way health is usually conceptualized, and what responsibilities does this information raise for research and your practices? And that's what I have for you all today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez, for your amazing presentation. And just looking at the question in the Q&A, it says, greetings, Dr. Gonzalez. Spiritual currency seems like a perfect term to describe asthma. Is that, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, and really the term applies to all of the traditional cultural activities that you have described, right? That's the
Yeah,
question.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah, I think we have these really beautiful ways of uh, being in reciprocal relationships, especially with our spiritual helpers, or recognizing that we each hold a spirit, and um, being using those spiritual currencies and whatever that looks like in your communities. And yeah, like not thinking about it. We have that one that's really, really strong, but we have all of these different sort of medicines or food that we cook or quilts that we make, right? That um, become those gifts, right? That we're giving in order to receive something back. One of our elders always says, like, the more you put in, the more you get back. So the more you put in, like, you're making your own quilt. You're not just going to Walmart and buying a quilt. You're putting that effort in, like you're going to get that much more spiritual help back. You're cooking your own food, right? He used to tease, like, you're not just stirring in the mac and cheese sauce. You're like putting in some effort, and that's just a tease. Like, everything is good when you bring it to ceremony, but yeah, so like the more you can give, right, the more you give back.
Awesome. I think that is all the question that is posed. So,
Trudy, there are a couple others that have just popped up in the
okay,
Q&A.
all right. So, next question is, I am a high school student wondering how we can eliminate this Western notion of deficient research regarding American Indian Alaska Native groups.
Oh, I'm unmuted. How we can what are
It
these?
says,
What did
it
she say?
says I'm a high school student
Yeah.
wondering how we can eliminate
Oh,
this
eliminate.
Western notion of deficient
Well,
research regarding Native groups.
I I don't think we can eliminate it so much as we can engage in it, um, to require Indigenous leadership. And when there's not an Indigenous PI, and both when there's Indigenous and when there's not an Indigenous PI, that we have Indigenous people in that are truly leading that project, that research, and kind of pushing against some of these folks who aren't including Indigenous people when they're doing research on Indigenous people, that's not something that's acceptable anymore, or that we're going to accept anymore. And as a high school student, I mean, like, if this is something that you feel, research is something that you feel is calling you, what I mean, to practice those things. If you're Indigenous, like, reach out to Indigenous mentors, because the field is hard, right? The academics is hard, but also, if you're a non-Indigenous person going into research, like really, creating those relationships with your Indigenous communities that you want to serve so that your leadership comes from them.
Thank you for your response. So the next question is, when did you decide that you wanted to become a scientist slash researcher, and how difficult has it been integrating our Indigenous work with Western work?
I probably around the time I decided to get my PhD. So I started my PhD in 2013. Even during my master's, I think I was still leaning towards more like practice-based public health. And I I chose the PhD program that I decided to go to because they had Indigenous professors in that program. um, I knew that I wanted that leadership, but I knew that I wanted to work on projects during my PhD that were actually relevant to my community. So having it's far and few between, right? But having that is always a plus. And then it 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 was a roller coaster. It was difficult at times. Um, felt there were several times in my between my education and early career that I'm like, I don't know if I want to actually do research. This might not be the best thing for my community. So it took a lot of a self-reflection too, to truly understand like what was my purpose here, and I see so many people doing amazing things that I really, really admire and look up to in my community, and many of them are language speakers and teaching the language. And so, like, I really did consider, like, maybe I just quit and I go be a teacher instead. But I kept coming back to research, and I think that was just me getting pulled back to um, a line of work that I'm really good at. I think that I really enjoy. Like, I really enjoy writing, and I really enjoy the conceptualization of a project and implementing a research project. The other piece that made doing this type of work a breeze was having that mentorship by Dr. Melissa Walls. Like um, I know that other folks that are do the type of work that I do don't have that same mentorship, um, and struggle a lot more. But if I can say anything, it's really and truly to bring that Indigenous piece of ourselves into the work, because that's what's going to be impactful to our communities. Um, and finding that support in other Indigenous people in your field, so that you guys can stand together, right? In doing it in a different way. And also a lot of prayers. I'm being honest, a lot of like using my SAMA, using my and praying about like, hey, really struggling, and I'm really having like, like I feel uneasy about this, that, or the other. And then allowing that process to help me decide on next steps or how to move forward, um, in a way that was healthy for myself and healthy for my community, healthy for my way of life too, and protection of that too.
Okay. Thank you for your response. So the next question is, while Indigenous ways of being healthy are focused on different things than Western ways, there are some people, like the previous Surgeon General, um, Vivek Murthy, whose parting prescription to the nation was, quote, choose community, unquote, as the path to creating health. What other leaders do you find inspiring to help our country better understand how we need to shift our thinking about health?
Yes, I love that. And I always too lean on that, like they had that epidemic of loneliness that they had put out. I'm like, yes, this is so true. This is where we need to in my field too. Like I feel lucky in a sense that I don't have to like define a disease all the time in order to move forward in my research. I think one of the hard things that I kind of touched on here is that like oftentimes in the health field you're like I got to choose a disease and then move forward on that. And that can be really limiting, right? Because, and for me anyways, because I feel like well-being is this like holistic idea. And I think that there's so many Indigenous women in particular, and Indigenous men too, that I look up to because they're doing work from their communities, they're allowing their communities to lead, they're really trying to reclaim um, and uplift, right, our Indigenous ways of knowing into our work. Um, so I even love being at the Center for Indigenous Health, working with folks like Dr. Walls and Dr. O'Keefe. I got to work with Dr. Tara Maudry for a short time. And these are some of the women that I really think we get to do this work because we're all trying to do this work and we can stand together.
Okay, thank you. And then the next one was just asking about they're interested in further conversation about studying Anishinaabe enculturation in relationship to childhood ACEs, and they're just asking for your email contact info. So um, then the next question was Western concepts of health are usually focused on the physical, isolated from emotional, spiritual, and relational well-being. I think the integration of all of these into the concept of well-being would need to start in Western society and most definitely into medical schools. So that was one. And then the final question was, could you please say a little more about the role of Indigenous language in personal and community well-being?
Yeah. So um, when I think about, and I was just in a conversation with somebody who made me think of this really strongly, is that like because English language is so different than our indigenous languages, especially I mean they're different than Ojibwe, that many of the things that get lost in translation, we can't even pick those things up unless we start understanding the language itself. And I'm all like a preacher of this, and I'm still like really struggling to learn the language, but the more that I can understand, the more that I can be like um, understand the nuances in in our language, in our teachings, right? And for like, if I'm thinking about those elders, they, if I'm thinking about the elders and what they taught about us about language in those interviews, um, or even like some of the stuff that's even out in the research is um, that language is completely connected to our mental health and even some of our like physical health, right? Um, and that language is often tied to a stronger cultural um, participation, right? So if we find that like more folks, if people are coming in the avenue of language, that they're also going to be connected to ceremonial way of life, to cultural way of life, that they're kind of like not just engaging in one thing, they're engaging in everything. The other thing is that, like, I think about one elder was talking about like how he perceived at our ceremonies, the amount of young people that were there who were also students of our immersion, our local immersion program. And he was like, man, it's because in his perspective, right? He's like, because they understand what's going on there. They understand why we're there. They're not just there just to like listen blindly. They actually understand what's going on and they see they understand the benefit of them being there. Um, and yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
Okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez, for
Yeah.
your amazing presentation. So just um, if you have any questions, Dr. Gonzalez's email is on the screen, so please feel free. Um, and then we're going to go to our closing slides. So in the chat box, just remember to click on the link over to complete the short survey that was provided. And if you're interested in viewing any of the past Indigenous Health Topic videos, they're uploaded on YouTube, and the link is in the chat as well. So, so with that said, our next Indigenous Health Topic will be on Friday, July 17, 2026, and it will be with Dr. Monica Yellowhair. She's the Assistant Director of Native American Partnership at the University of Arizona Comprehensive Cancer Center. And so we look forward to Dr. Yellowhair sharing. And then if you have any other suggestions over for speakers, please feel free over to share as well, because we want to include great individuals that are doing great work across Indian country. So with that, if there are no other questions posed in the Q&A, on behalf of the Mayo Clinic, and want to give a sincere thank you to Dr. Gonzalez, as well as to my colleagues who are assisting behind the scenes over to help make this a successful event. And for those of you that are attending events in your community for Juneteenth, be well, be safe, and then until we see each other again, in Navajo, we say Hagona. That means I'll see you again. So thank you very much for joining us for Indigenous Health Topic, and you have a safe and wonderful weekend, and happy Father's Day to all the fathers across Turtle Island. Thank you.